Right, hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Book of Ruth, and I really want to focus on the theme of migration and immigration in the Book of Ruth, because canonically this book also emerges right after the Book of Judges, and Judges tells us a lot about the experiences and the challenges that Israel, the Hebrew people, as recently arrived immigrants to a new land. It tells us a lot about the challenges that they had in assimilating and also resisting assimilation with the Canaanite culture. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at Ruth in its canonical context, Ruth as a Moabite woman, and also the book of Ruth in general through the theme of migration. There's this passage, very famous passage in the book of Ruth, and Ruth says, or at least it mentions the following. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Quick question. What do you think this passage means? This leads me to a couple of other additional questions. I'm glad you brought that out. Does this suggest that Ruth, the Moabite, is abandoning her racial identity as a Moabite when she states, your people shall be my people? Is this also a claim that Ruth is having a religious conversion and becoming for the first time a person who will worship the God of Israel? Or this is another question. Is this proof that immigrants can join the people of Israel, convert, and assimilate into their culture and way of life, including and not excluding the religious aspects to the Hebrew people's identity? So here we have Ruth. She's this Moabite. Now, she also is a migrant. She's an immigrant that is traveling with her mother-in-law. Now, a couple of things about Ruth, and especially the way that she emerges in this story, and also deeply why Ruth resonates with so many migrant communities today. Um, but we often think about generally people, especially immigrants, as people who are a burden to society, or at times, refuse to assimilate into the majority culture. So we do have this sense where immigrants may be perceived as unwilling to learn the language of the host country, which also leads to segregation and isolation within ethnic enclaves or communities. Some believe immigrants isolate themselves and maintain their cultural practices and customs without really desiring to integrate into the broader society. And we also have within our contemporary world and context that stereotype that immigrants reject like the values and the norms of the host country and cling to their own traditions, even if they conflict with local customs. And another thing that we do see globally when we're thinking about immigrants is that sometimes they're unfairly characterized as disloyal or even ungrateful to the new country or even refusing to be patriots or participate in civic duties. And so we often see within the global context, we see that in Ireland, we see that in Poland, we see that in Latin American US relation, we see it all over. Migration itself is a global phenomenon. It's not just something that happens within the North American continent. But there are a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions rather than really reflecting the realities of immigrant experiences. But when we look at the book of Ruth, it actually gives us an interesting portrait of how migrants in the ancient Near East during the Old Testament times how they not only joined communities, but also became valuable members and also contributed to the common good. Because as we could recall, or at least think about the Pentateuch in Genesis, how Abraham himself was also a migrant who traveled down as a result of an ecological famine. And that's when Sarah, his wife, was taken into she was trafficked by the kings. And we also have the famous story of Moses and the Hebrew people who migrate from Egypt, and they arrive at the promised land. The whole almost the Pentateuch itself, from Exodus to Deuteronomy, is a story of migration. It's a story of journey through the wilderness. And now we're here in the Book of Ruth, another story. Now, the Book of Ruth, however, has not always been read as an immigrant story. Sometimes it's generally viewed as that book that connects the period of the judges to the monarchy with King David and all the kings that happened after them, the splitting of the kingdom and everything. Or sometimes Ruth is highlighted specifically just because how she was King David's ancestor and how God preserved the family of the patriarchs, and it went through Ruth, Ruth and Boaz specifically. And also, too, we may read the Book of Ruth, especially in light of origin or Christian allegorical readings in the early church fathers, as a story of just God's faithfulness, or a Christological reading of Boaz and Ruth, between Boaz as a figure of Christ, or and Ruth as a figure of the Gentile community. This is perhaps the most popular reading of the Book of Ruth, where it's foreshadowing Jesus as a kinsman redeemer. So we do see these different ways of reading the Book of Ruth, whether it's a book that connects the story of the judges to the monarchy, a book that talks about the faithfulness of God, even through, the least expected, such as a Moabite woman, or what we see more popularly today, especially in a lot of theological textbooks or even surveys of the Old Testament, is where we read Ruth through the lens of Jesus, and how this is a foreshadowing of Jesus as a kinsman redeemer, the way Boaz was with Ruth. But another lens, and also too, this is not to say that those ways of reading are wrong. They're not. They're great. They're different ways of reading and seeing this story. But another thing that we can add to our kaleidoscope is reading this as a story of migration, reading this story as a woman's immigrant story. So this is another way of thinking about Ruth through the lens of migration. When we look at the book, it perhaps we don't really know as to when the book exactly was written, because the book is anonymous. Like, we don't really have an idea of who the author was. But it was probably written during the monarchy between 1000 to 500 BCE. We do know, though, that the setting of this book was during the period of the judges. So this is a setting, and it starts in Ruth 1:1 when it says, "In the days when the judges." So that immediately connects the book of Ruth during the context of the book of Judges. Because that's in the book of Judges, you have all the various judges that emerge and lead Israel for a specific period of time. So the book of Ruth, canonically, is to be read within this context of the book of Judges. And as we know, as we discussed in previous lectures, this was a time after Moses and Joshua, when you had all of these Canaanite city states that were pressuring, threatening the newly arrived Israelites in the promised land. And we see in this map here, this was Israel during the time of the judges. But we also see that the Philistines, they were primarily on the coastal region. And at the end of the book of Joshua, the coastal region of the promised land had yet to be conquered. So at the end of Joshua, they were still the coastal regions weren't conquered. And this includes the following regions of Gaza, Ashdod, Gath, Ashkelon, and Ekron. So these coastal regions here. And these coastal regions, or the Philistines in these regions, they did create a lot of tension and problems for only for Joshua, but also for the descendants thereafter. So the people of Israel, they are newly arrived immigrants from Egypt. They arrived at the promised land. And now, one of the main tensions and issues that we see in the book of Judges is they're worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. So you see this in Judges. Everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. And in a sense, Judges, in the book of Judges, you see the people of Israel that they're becoming more and more like their Canaanite neighbors, and they are assimilating to the Canaanite culture, worshiping their gods, and becoming like them, and abandoning their traditions, abandoning the law of Moses, abandoning what they were taught by Joshua. Now, question emerges: who did the Canaanites worship? Now, it is true the Canaanites, they worship many gods and goddesses. One of the gods is named El, which it's a generic term that means God, but that was also a similar term that was used to describe the head of the Canaanite pantheon. Um, this was also a creator god that had many, many other fathered other deities. But the most important term that does emerge a lot is the term Baal, and this is a term that emerges in the book of Judges a lot. And also, too, when you look in the book of Kings, if you could think of Elisha, who had his confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Now, Baal, this was a title, originally meant Lord or Master, and the bull was a symbol of this god, and it symbolized strength, power, and fertility. So this is the context when we're looking at the Book of Ruth and also the neighboring gods of the Canaanites. Additionally, Israel, they were very much influenced by the Canaanites. And so here's just a couple of passages from the book of Judges to help us understand what's going on here, especially in Judges, because in the book of Judges, you notice that the Hebrew people, the Israelites who just arrived in the promised land, after a generation or so, they started just to worship the gods of the Canaanites. So here you have in Judges 2:10, and all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work which he had done for Israel. And likewise, you can see in the following verses where they started to serve and worship other gods, giving their gods to those, excuse me, giving their sons to those gods and worshiping their gods. Or in Judges 3:7, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgetting their Lord, their God, and serving the Baals and the Asherah. So everyone was basically doing what was right in their own eyes, and also worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. So we can see already in the book of Judges that the Israelites, they're assimilating to the Canaanite culture. They're now adopting the gods of the Canaanites, and they are this recently newly arrived community. So within the next generation, within 2 generations, they start to forget the ways of the Lord. Overall, this was a period of moral assimilation to the Canaanite way of life. The Israelites were worshiping the other gods or forgetting the Lord their God. And in many ways, they were becoming just like the Canaanites, the Syrians, the Philistines. They were losing their identity. They were forgetting the ways of the Lord. They were no longer repeating the stories of Moses and the Exodus to their children. And they were failing to tell their children and teach their children the law, the Mosaic law. This was the context of Judges, and it's also the context of Ruth. And what we can see in Judges is that the Israelites are assimilating to the Canaanite culture. This was also a period in which there was resistance and there was war with the surrounding enemies. And God also used many, many, many judges, raised them up, filled them with His Holy Spirit, and empowered them to lead the Hebrew people, to lead the Israelites, and help them regain a sense of their own identity, their own sense of self, and also renew themselves in acknowledging and worshiping God. And so you have stories like Deborah, other stories when the Israelites were subjected to the Medians or the Philistines, and then they're liberated again. And then perhaps one of the most famous story too is the story of Samson. And so the setting of Ruth, again, this was also during a period of famine. And this is striking because the Canaanites also worship Baal, and this was a storm god. This was one of the gods of the Canaanite pantheon, and this god supposedly was in control of the weather. And so what we also find is as a storm god, as this deity, Baal, this god was supposed to also provide nourishment to the agricultural fields, send rain, and help the people survive. But there's a famine. And then all of a sudden, you know, we start to also notice that this storm god Baal, he is not really doing what he is supposed to do. And so this period of famine also makes us think and reflect upon the confrontations that the prophets had with the prophets of Baal, especially when we're looking at Elijah, um, and how that in that confrontation he's urging them, like, call upon your God to send down fire and all this stuff. That god Baal was supposedly in control of the elements. One of the most interesting things that we could also notice is that in the book of Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, um, if the Hebrew people were to follow the law, keep the law, God actually promised that He would take care of them. But if they disregarded the law, they would go through a famine. They will have to endure and deal with the lack of rain. And so here you have even two passages in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that emerge also as a warning, like, hey, if you fail to honor the law, if you fail to keep the law, the Lord could allow you to go through a drought. This also helps us realize that when you're thinking about the God of the Israelites, the God of the Israelites is always portrayed as a creator God, as the only one who is in control of all the forces of nature. And so, in a sense, God not only sends the rain, but also withholds the rain. And by sending lightning and ending drought, it shows that God, the God of the Israelites, is actually more powerful than Baal, than those gods. And we could also notice when you're reading Leviticus and Deuteronomy is that the famine itself was believed to be a curse from God and also the result of worshiping other gods. In other words, it was a result of them assimilating to the Canaanite culture and religion. So let's look at these two books, Judges and Ruth, just side by side when we compare them canonically. When you're looking at the book of Judges, the Israelites, they're newly arrived immigrants into the land of Canaan. The Israelites are pressured to become like the Canaanites and worship their gods. And one of the biggest struggles that we see in the book of Judges is that they struggle with this assimilation and acculturation and also a sense of resistance. They need to resist. They need to maintain their identity as the chosen people of God. And one of the failures that we see is that the Israelites, they were forgetting the Lord and his ways, and they're becoming like their neighbors. And you can see how this kind of also is in contrast to the book of Ruth, because Ruth also, she's a Moabite immigrant who travels to the land of Israel. And Ruth herself, she becomes like the Israelites and she expresses this desire to worship their God. And Ruth, she is incorporated into the Israelite community. And we see, as we see much later, including in the New Testament, she's included in the lineage of King David and also Jesus. And we also could see, in comparison to Judges, that Ruth, she desired to have the God of Israel become her God and worship him. So, on the one hand, we see in the book of Judges the failure of the Israelites in becoming like the Canaanites. But on the other hand, we see Ruth, who, as a Moabite, she actually succeeds in the sense that she actually becomes like the Israelites. And she adopts their ways and she embraces their God and she leaves behind her identity as she joins this newly arrived community. She's an immigrant even to the immigrants. But let's step back also to think about Moabites. Who are these? Who are these people? Just very brief background on the Moabites. Here's a map here. You kind of see where Moab is, and perhaps some of the famous cities that are associated with Moab is Sodom and Gomorrah. Those are the two famous cities that are associated with this region. Um, they were related to the Israelites through Abraham's nephew Lot. If you can remember that story in Genesis 19, when Lot departs from Abraham and Abraham and Lot chooses this region of Moab. Um, when also Moses was crossing through the desert, they actually gave um, they showed hostility to Moses. And so you're here, you have Balak, the Moabite king, who commissions Balaam to curse them. You can remember that story of that curse of Balaam was trying to curse them, and then the angel of the Lord comes by, and then the donkey speaks. Um, and there's also even this curse upon the Moabites for not showing the Hebrew people hospitality after they left Egypt. And this is found in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 through 6, you notice here it says, no Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none belong to them shall enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came forth out of Egypt. Moabites, they're not really portrayed in a positive light when you're looking at the book of Numbers or in Deuteronomy. But they do show some sense of sympathy to King David. In fact, when King David was a fugitive escaping Saul, King David actually asked him to take care of his mother and father. So this is one striking passage in First Samuel. Um, we're not too sure why the Moabites took in King David's mother, but it is possible that, perhaps through Ruth, they had some sense of a kingship diplomacy because King David, in some sense, was related to the Moabites. But as I mentioned earlier, when you're looking at the book of Ezra as well, the Moabites, they're actually portrayed also very negatively because they intermingled with the Jewish people. In the book of Ezra 9, verse 1 through 2, you can see this mixture of the Moabites and Jewish people. This was considered to be by Ezra an issue, and so they needed to expel the wives of foreign women. And also you can see this in the book of Nehemiah, where the Moabites are also again excluded from the assembly of God. And no pun intended there, the assemblies of God. But there is this post-exilic desire to separate themselves from the Moabites and who are already part of the Israelite community. So these passages, in some sense, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, may demonstrate that there actually were Moabites that were living there in Judea, that they were part of the community already. So, in light of that, and thinking about the Moabites, the history that they've had with the Israelites, and also understanding too the context of Ruth, the book of Ruth, in light of the book of Judges, this helps us kind of like understand the frame in which we read the book of Ruth. So, as we're reading Ruth, we can see that this is not just a Moabite woman that her and her people whom she represents. It's not just like an innocent community. It would have raised alarm bells to readers of this literature. It would have like what's the Moabites? Those who were excluded in Ezra, or those who didn't offer any hospitality to Moses. So all of these other stories here that we could think about, they would have been something that they would have thought about in light of the context of this book, especially when we're thinking about the Old Testament as it's received during the time of Jesus. But let's reread Ruth. So I'll go over just the first chapter. So, as we know with this story, the book of Ruth, it starts with the famine. You have Noemi, who and her sons, they were living in the land of Moab because of a famine. So you can see the migration to Moab was as a result of a famine. But then 10 years later, while they're in Moab, Naomi's two sons, they die. They leave her alone, and she's alone with her Moabite daughters-in-law, Orpha and Ruth. And so because she's now a widow, she realizes, okay, I'm in a foreign land. I'm going to go back to my hometown. And so this is why she returns to Bethlehem in the land of Judah. This is where we get that famous passage where Naomi is telling her daughter-in-laws, just go back with your people, or stay with your people, remarry, don't worry about me. I'm gonna go to my homeland. But then Ruth says, like, no, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Now Orpha actually is the one who stays. So she doesn't get a lot of attention in the story just because she doesn't travel. It's Ruth that really emerges, but we do have Orpha, who is also present in this story. And so here in Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. So they travel from Moab and they go all the way to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has afflicted me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth and the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So they both traveled. They arrived to Bethlehem, but it's only Ruth who is the true immigrant, and she's described within these opening passages as the Moabite. Now, we also can notice that Naomi does not introduce Ruth. She doesn't introduce Ruth to the community. There is none of that. It's just Naomi and her distress and her experience with God as a result of her children, her sons dying. Um, Naomi may have felt shame for actually living in Moab. She doesn't even want to be called Naomi anymore. Um, and so there's this sense of shame or this sense of like disgrace for what she has experienced, but the entire town is aware of her presence. And again, as I mentioned, notice how Ruth is not really introduced in the story. So there is a sense of a homecoming, but it's also an awkward homecoming. As it is whenever we haven't seen somebody in a long time, or if you've grown up in your hometown and you leave and then you come back, sometimes those returns are not as pleasant. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're very wonderful. We have a lot of those departures and returns, even with college students that we experience all the time. Cars, or even young people in our youth ministries. They go to college, they leave. 4 or 5 years later, they come back. They're different, obviously. But this departure and return. The return of Naomi is not a very pleasant welcoming. It's not a very positive homecoming. So when we turn to chapter 2, a couple of questions will emerge. How does Naomi emerge? Excuse me, how does not Naomi, how does Ruth emerge within this story? So the first question for Ruth, chapter 2. Pay close attention to Ruth's actions, especially her interaction with Boaz and how others treat her. What do her words and her behavior reveal about her understanding of her social status and rights? How is Ruth portrayed in this story? How does the way Ruth is described in chapter 4 and throughout the book, how does it reveal how others see her versus how the narrator sees her? So, what does this also show us about her identity, her belonging, and how even communities draw boundaries? So, let's look at chapter 4. Um, how do the characters within the story, how do they describe Ruth? But then also, how does the storyteller, the writer of this book, whom we have no idea wrote it, how does the storyteller describe Ruth? And what does this show us about identity, belonging, and the boundaries that communities draw? So another thing when we look at the book of Ruth, um, another vantage point or a lens in which we could read her story is really through the lens of migration and really recognizing her as a Moabite immigrant. Now, there's this one really good popular writer by the name of Karen Gonzalez. She remarks that this is a story of an immigrant woman, a woman who arrives in Judah and is welcomed and accepted as one of Judah's own, an immigrant woman who leaves her country, her language, and culture out of love for her elderly mother-in-law. As a Moabite, Ruth does exemplify the identity of many migrants who boldly travel to a foreign land out of loyalty for their family. And this is one of the themes that we could see because she has this love and this devotion. That's what compels her, compels Ruth to risk her own future and work for her surviving family, for Naomi, who's her mother-in-law. And so, in the same way, we also see many immigrant women. They also leave their homeland. They leave their families. They leave their children. But it's out of their love and devotion to their families and their desire to support them that they take these big and bold risks. But also, Ruth, as an immigrant Moabite, she also dispels all of the stereotypes that may have been popularly associated with immigrants, not just with today, but even back then. Because notice, she becomes an Israelite. She follows the local customs. She observes the laws and also the faith of the Israelites. And she comes to a foreign land to work, not to take or to steal or anything like that or expect support, but she goes and she works the field. So she does what she can to survive. And so what we see here with this Moabite portrayal of Ruth, or at least, excuse me, this immigrant portrayal of Ruth, is that it really dispels any fears or suspicions of immigrants who come to the land of Judah. They come to work, they come to help their family, and it is sometimes as a result of the difficult situations in their homeland that forces them to migrate. So we not only see Ruth or Abraham or Moses and others, but we see this throughout the entire New Testament as well. And even with the end of the New Testament, you see the story of the people of God migrating to the new land, which is the New Jerusalem. But overall, one of the most important things about Ruth in this story is just how she is connected and her story and her memory is preserved. And it's also included in the lineage of Jesus. This is one of the fascinating things about this story is that in the lineage of Jesus, he has a hardworking immigrant woman who lived and was a part of his story. And Jesus wouldn't have been Jesus if it had not been for the immigrant Moabite woman. Um, really great story, fascinating story. It's one that we could draw a lot of inspiration and hope for from. but it's also one that I truly appreciate, especially as it curtails and pushes against some of the rhetoric about Moabites that we may see in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah.